want to comment on the distinguished senator from California and North Carolina on their important work on the cyber bill. I know we're going to be discussing a lot of that, how important that is to our national security. What I wanted to do this afternoon was talk about another important bill that's moving its way through the process of becoming law, and that's the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. You know, Mr. President, like many of us, I spent last week back home in my great state of Alaska. And in Alaska, it's hard not to see the strength and pride in our military everywhere, every day, everywhere you go. I'll provide a few examples. We had what's called the Alaska Federation of Natives Convention. It's an annual convention we have with a very important group of Alaskans. And the theme this year was Heroes Among Us at the convention. And it was about heroes among us because Alaska Natives serve in the U.S. military at higher rates than any other ethnic group in the country. A real special kind of patriotism. So I had the honor really to meet dozens of these great veterans from all kinds of wars. Met some veterans from World War II, the At-2 campaign. A lot of Americans don't realize Alaska was actually invaded by the Japanese, and we had to fight to eject them in the Aleutian Islands. Met veterans from the Philippine campaign under General MacArthur. Met veterans from the Korean War, Chosin Reservoir. Had the great opportunity to meet an honor flight coming back from Washington, our veterans from World War II and Korea. And of course, just walking around Anchorage, you see and you hear military members training all the time. We have a great base, J-Bear, F-22s ripping through the sky. Our members, our military members, keeping us safe. What we call in Alaska the sound of freedom, when you hear those jets roaring. So that's everywhere. And in Alaska, we love our veterans, our military, we honor them, and we know that providing for the national defense of our great nation and taking care of our troops and taking care of our veterans is certainly one of the most important things we do in the United States Senate. And of course, it's not just Alaska. Mr. President, I'm sure when you were home in the great state of Nebraska that there's that same feeling, that patriotic feeling of supporting our troops and the importance of our national defense. And for the most part, that feeling exists here in Washington. And I have the honor to sit on two committees that focus on these issues a lot. On the Armed Services Committee, on the Veterans Affairs Committee, and these are very bipartisan committees. Very bipartisan, where the support for our national defense, our troops, our veterans is across the board, both sides of the aisle, no doubt about it. But I do say for the most part, because as you know, Mr. President, nothing is truly as it seems here in Washington, D.C. And I've spoken on the floor, a number of us have, about what motivated a number of us last year to actually throw our hat in the ring and run for the U.S. Senate. And Mr. President, like you, I know that a lot of us were concerned about the country going in the wrong direction, about a dysfunction in Washington, about a government that's run up an $18 trillion debt, no economic growth, our credit rating downgraded, no amendments even brought on the Senate floor, no budget for the federal government, even attempted. No appropriations bills attempted for years. The most deliberative body in the world was certainly a body that had been shut down. And a lot of us thought we need to change that. So we're starting to change that. We're back to regular order. We're talking here about debating bills. There's been dozens, if not hundreds of amendments already this year. Last year there's only 14. We passed a budget. We passed 12 appropriations bills to fund the government, very bipartisan. And we're focusing on the issues, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's defense, whether it's taking care of our veterans, that the vast majority of the American people want us to focus on. So, for example, Mr. President, we brought to the floor two critical appropriations bills just a couple months ago, the Defense Appropriations Bill and the Veterans Affairs and Military Construction Bill. These passed out of the Appropriations Committee by huge bipartisan majorities, 27-3 on the Defense Appropriations Bill, 21-9 on the Veterans Affairs Bill. This is what the American people want us to do, back to regular order, funding the government, putting together a budget. So far, so good. That's what we were called to do. But here's where the dysfunction of Washington, D.C. began to rear its head again. These bills that are critical to our troops, our defense, our veterans, strong bipartisan support in the committee, were brought to the floor of the U.S. Senate, and they were filibustered. They were filibustered. Let me say that again. The bills that fund our military, that fund our national defense, that take care of our veterans, were filibustered, were blocked, were stopped by our friends on the other side of the aisle. Not sure why. Still don't know why. Matter of fact, I haven't seen anyone who actually voted to filibuster these important bills come down to the Senate floor and say, here's why we voted against funding our troops. Here's why we voted against funding our veterans. And I think the overwhelming majority of Americans, regardless of what state they live in, would say, no, you needed to vote for these bills. Funding the military, funding our veterans, funding our national defense, that's one of the most important things we do. That's one of the most important things we want you to do. So bottom line on that, on those votes, Mr. President, our troops, our veterans, our national defense were shortchanged because they didn't get funded. Then we moved on to the Defense Authorization Bill, what I wanted to talk about today. This is an annual undertaking, sets the policies, programs, defense strategy for our military. It also authorizes spending on national defense and on our military. And it's certainly, again, one of the most important things I think this body does. And I think most senators on both sides of the aisle would agree with that. And once again, like the appropriations bills, we were working very closely together on this, bipartisan. I was on the Armed Services Committee as this moved through the committee, and it was very bipartisan. It was voted out on a strong bipartisan vote to come to the floor. I want to commend Chairman McCain, who did a great job on that, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Ranking Member Jack Reed from Rhode Island, who did a fantastic job. But I must admit, Mr. President, I feared a little bit of a replay in terms of the scenario that we saw with the appropriations bills, meaning strong bipartisan support out of the committee and then coming to the Senate floor and being filibustered. I feared this in part because at one point during the defense authorization debate, the minority leader came and stated that the defense authorization bill was, quote, a waste of time. A waste of time. The defense authorization bill. Tell that to the Marines and the soldiers and the airmen and the sailors and their families. Those members of the military who are defending our country right now, that this bill was a waste of time. I guarantee you they would not agree with that statement. And fortunately, neither did the U.S. Senate. To the contrary, the Senate has now voted on the defense authorization bill twice, once as an original bill, once as part of a conference report, with very strong bipartisan and veto-proof majorities. 71 senators the first time around, 73 when we voted on it a couple weeks ago. Now, Mr. President, I mentioned that phrase, veto-proof majorities. And I have to mention that veto-proof majority phrase because, incredibly, the President of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief, has said he's going to veto this bill when it comes to his desk. It was just sent to him yesterday. Now, I don't know how the Commander-in-Chief is going to explain that to the troops, or to their families, or to the American people, or to the 73 senators who voted for that bill. And one thing I think it's important to recognize, Mr. President, sometimes we think, hey, this is all inside Washington, no one's really following it. Well, on something like this impacts morale. When the Commander-in-Chief is saying, hey, troops, I'm going to veto this. This is a copy of the Marine Corps Times. I get the Marine Corps Times. I read the Marine Corps Times. A lot of Marines and members of the military read this all over the world. Guarantee our guys deployed and women overseas read the Marine Corps Times. So in this edition of the Marine Corps Times, there's an article talking about how President Obama has vowed to veto the Defense Authorization Bill. So we got Marines fighting overseas who are reading this, and they're not getting it. Let me give you a couple quotes from this article. Again, just this week in the Marine Corps Times. The Military Officers Association of America and other military advocacy groups have argued against a presidential veto, calling this legislation critical policy that cannot be delayed. The NDAA has been signed into law 53 years in a row and includes a host of specialty pay and bonus reauthorizations. Here's a quote from the Military Officers Association of America in this article that thousands of our active duty troops are reading. Quote, "The fact is that we are still a nation at war, and this legislation is vital to fulfilling wartime requirements. There comes a time when this year's legislative business must be completed and remaining disagreements left to be addressed next year." Mr. President, to govern is to choose. To govern is to prioritize. Now, President Obama's administration has spent years negotiating the Iran deal, and this body spent weeks debating the president's Iran deal. So we put a lot of time. The president's administration has put an enormous amount of time. By the way, on that agreement, on the Iran deal, part of the hope from Secretary Kerry and the president and the others was that once it got passed by the U.S. Congress, by the way, a minority vote, partisan minority vote, that Iran would somehow start to change its behavior, because they look at America as someone they want to partner with. So since the Senate passed the Iran deal, let's see what's happened. Iran has sent troops to Syria. Iran has backed Hamas, which is now engaging in knife-murdering attacks against Israelis. An Iranian leader has stated that Israel shouldn't exist within the next 25 years. Iran has violated the ballistic missile UN Security Council resolutions, and I think, and many others, have already violated the Iran deal by firing ballistic missiles with the range of 1,000 miles. Iran has sentenced an American reporter for the Washington Post for spying. So I don't think that the behavior that a lot of the supporters of this deal anticipated is happening. But more broadly, Mr. President, I think it's important to put into context what's going on with our national security and the NDAA and moving forward on the Iran deal and the president's threat to veto the NDAA. The president's Iran deal, once implemented, will be giving billions, tens of billions, to Iran the world's biggest state sponsor of terrorism, but the president threatens to veto our defense bill that actually funds our military. The president's Iran deal will lift sanctions on Iranian leaders, such as General Soleimani, who literally has the blood of American soldiers on his hands. But the president threatens to veto U.S. troop pay bonuses and improved military retirement benefits. The president's Iran deal gives Iran access to conventional weapons and ballistic missile technology and advanced nuclear centrifuges. But the president threatens to veto funding for advanced weapon systems for our armed forces. And finally, the president's Iran deal certainly is going to allow more funding for terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. But the president is threatening to veto a bill that provides additional resources for our troops to fight terrorists like ISIS. Mr. President, to govern is to choose. To govern is to prioritize. Has it really come to the point where the White House is more focused on freeing up funds for Iranian terrorists than funding America's brave men and women in uniform? I certainly hope not. So I ask all my fellow senators who voted for this bill in a very strong bipartisan way, and my fellow Alaskans, fellow Americans, to reach out to the White House, let them know that you oppose the president's veto of this bill. What we need is a strong military, particularly now. We need to support our troops and our veterans, and we need President Obama to sign, not veto, this bill, which is critical to our national defense. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.